November 2009, Helmand Province, Afghanistan. A British cavalry trooper steps out of his jackal vehicle, presses his shoulder against a sun-baked mud wall, and raises a rifle that looks utterly unremarkable. It is olive drab and bolt action, and it lacks the aggressive silhouette of the heavy weapons surrounding it. It is the kind of rifle you would walk past in an armory without a second glance. But 2,475 meters away, nearly a mile and a half, two Taliban machine gunners are pinning down a British patrol. They are so far away that the shooter's scope physically cannot dial in enough elevation to compensate for the drop. To hit them, he has to aim at a patch of empty sky 40 stories above their heads and trust that gravity and the mathematics of ballistics will carry the bullet home. If you were staring at a target nearly a full kilometer beyond your weapon's rated maximum, with the lives of 12 of your comrades hanging on a 6-second flight of a bullet, would you trust the math enough to pull the trigger? This is the story of the L115A3, the unassuming British rifle that set a world record, the weapon that changed a doctrine, and the man who carried a burden far heavier than the gun itself. To understand why this rifle had to exist, you have to spend a few minutes inside the brutal geometry of the Afghan theater in the mid-2000s. Afghanistan is not the kind of war most soldiers trained for. It is not a war of hedgerows and tree lines and short-range ambushes. The valleys of Helmand and Kandahar are vast and open, bounded by ridgelines that can sit a kilometer or more from the nearest road. A machine gun team positioned on high ground at that distance commands a field of fire that is effectively unanswerable by most of the weapons a British infantry section carries. Rifles, general-purpose machine guns, even underslung grenade launchers, they all top out well before the problem begins. The standard sniper cartridge at the time was the 7.62 by 51 mm NATO round, fired from the L96 sniper rifle. It is a reliable, proven, accurate cartridge, but it has a ceiling. Once a 7.62 NATO bullet passes roughly 800 meters, it begins to decelerate through the transonic zone, that turbulent band between supersonic and subsonic flight, where air resistance becomes chaotic and unpredictable. Accuracy degrades sharply. Lethality at that range against a combatant in cover is not guaranteed, and the Taliban's commanders had done the math. They began positioning PKM machine gun teams at 900, 1,000, sometimes 1,100 meters, just far enough to sit inside what British soldiers began calling the gap, close enough to pour sustained fire into a patrol, far enough to be effectively immune from return fire. The only platform that could theoretically reach them was the L-82A1, the British variant of the Barrett M82 50 caliber anti-material rifle. It has the range, it has the terminal authority, but it weighs just over 14 kilograms unloaded, and that is before you add ammunition, before you add the mount, before you add the spotting optics. It is a crew-served weapon in practical terms. It requires a vehicle to move, a static position to deploy from, and it produces a muzzle blast so substantial that the moment you fire it, your position is declared to everyone within 500 meters. For a sniper pair trying to work in concealment through mountainous terrain, it is the wrong tool entirely. British commanders, planners, and, critically, the soldiers themselves recognized this. They didn't need a bigger weapon, they needed a smarter one. They needed something that could bridge the gap, a cartridge with enough velocity and mass to remain stable and lethal past 1,200 meters, housed in a rifle light enough for a single operator to carry on a dismounted patrol through the mountains of Helmand without it defining the mission around itself. That answer had been sitting in ammunition catalogs since 1989. It was the .338 Lapua Magnum, and the rifle built to contain it had been sitting in an armorer's cage, green and unassuming, waiting for exactly this moment. Most legendary weapons are born in the cavernous design halls of defense primes, Lockheed, BAE, Rheinmetall, the great machinery of government procurement. The L115A3 was born in a workshop in Portsmouth, and it was designed by a man whose primary credential was not a security clearance, but a pair of Olympic gold medals. Malcolm Cooper was a competitive target shooter. He won gold at Los Angeles in 1984 and retained it at Seoul in 1988 in the 50-meter three-position rifle event, one of the most technically demanding individual sports in the Olympic program. Cooper did not view a rifle as a weapon of war. He viewed it as a scientific instrument, a device for translating human intent into a physical event with maximum fidelity and minimum noise. Every variable that introduced uncertainty was, to Cooper, an engineering problem with a solvable answer. In 1978, he founded Accuracy International in Portsmouth with that philosophy as its foundation. His first commercial designs were target rifles, long, unwieldy things built for the prone position on a clean shooting mat. But the insight that drove them was the same insight that would eventually reach the mountains of Afghanistan. The breakthrough was the chassis system. Traditional rifle construction beds the barreled action, the mechanical heart of the weapon, into a stock made from wood or fiberglass. The stock provides structural support and gives the shooter something to hold and press against their shoulder. But wood absorbs moisture. It swells in humidity and contracts in cold. The geometry of the action sitting inside it shifts subtly as the stock changes shape around it. At 200 meters, that shift is invisible. At 1,000 meters, it means the difference between a hit and a miss. Fiberglass is better than wood, but not immune to the problem. Temperature cycling, the aggressive swing between cold nights and hot days, can introduce the same kinds of micro-shifts. Cooper's solution was to eliminate the stock as a structural component entirely. He built a full-length spine from machined aluminum, rigid, dimensionally stable, immune to humidity and temperature within any range a soldier would encounter. The barreled action bolted directly to this spine. The green polymer panels that give the rifle its distinctive silhouette are not structural. They are cosmetic shields bolted to the chassis to protect the shooter's hands from a scalding barrel and to reduce radar and visual signature. Remove them and the rifle still functions perfectly. The skeleton is what matters. This design, refined through the 1980s and 1990s, became the Arctic Warfare series. The Arctic Warfare Magnum, the AWM, extended the bolt face and magazine to accept larger cartridges. When Accuracy International chambered the AWM in .338 Lapua Magnum and demonstrated its capabilities to the British Ministry of Defence, the response was not enthusiasm. It was the more complicated emotion of an institution recognizing that something it did not know it needed had just solved a problem it had not yet fully articulated. The Mode ordered the weapon in 2007 under the designation L115A3. Each unit cost £23,000. That is roughly triple the price of a standard infantry rifle, and a procurement decision that requires significant institutional confidence in the platform. That confidence was not misplaced. Before we follow a bullet on its 2.5-kilometer journey, it is worth spending time inside the weapon itself. Because the L115A3 is not simply a scaled-up version of a conventional rifle. Almost every component has been rethought from first principles. The barrel is 686 millimeters long, nearly 27 inches, and it is cold hammer forged. That process involves driving a tungsten carbide mandrel through a steel blank while mechanized hammers strike the exterior tens of thousands of times per minute. The steel flows around the mandrel under pressure, forming the rifling grooves from the inside out. The result is a barrel that is harder, denser, and more dimensionally consistent than one cut by conventional button rifling or broaching methods. The bore is uniform to tolerances measured in thousandths of a milliliter. That uniformity is not precision for its own sake. It is the physical prerequisite for the accuracy the weapon is being asked to produce. The rifling twist rate is 1 turn in 10 inches. For a 250-grain .338 Lapua Magnum projectile, a bullet roughly the weight of a large grape, traveling at nearly 1,000 meters per second, that spin rate is a carefully calculated compromise. Too slow a twist and the bullet precesses, tumbling in flight as the gyroscopic forces can't stabilize it. too fast, and the centrifugal stresses begin to threaten the bullet's structural integrity at high velocity. 1 in 10 is the number Accuracy International engineers arrived at after extensive testing, and it remains the standard for this cartridge class. The trigger is a two-stage design with a pull weight adjustable between 1 and 1.5 kilograms. That number matters because at 2,000 meters, an unintended lateral movement of less than a millimeter at the trigger can translate to a miss by more than a meter at the target. The trigger is the last mechanical link in a chain of human intent. Its design is not about comfort. It is about eliminating every possible source of variability in the moment the shooter has worked for minutes or hours to arrive at. The folding adjustable stock allows the length of pull and cheek height to be set independently. A sniper might be wearing a lightweight patrol smock in summer and a bulky Arctic layer in winter. The rifle accommodates both without requiring the shooter to adapt their technique to the weapon. The weapon adapts to the shooter. The suppressor deserves a particular note because its function is commonly misunderstood. A suppressed L115A3 firing supersonic ammunition is not quiet. The bullet, traveling at over 900 meters per second, creates a sharp crack as it breaks the sound barrier, a crack that is impossible to suppress because it is generated by the projectile itself, not by the weapon. What the suppressor eliminates is the muzzle blast, the high-pressure, high-temperature gas that follows the bullet out of the barrel, producing the dramatic flash and concussive report that announces a firing position. For a sniper working alone, often ahead of the main force, suppressing that muzzle signature is not a luxury, it is survival.
The .338 Lapua Magnum did not appear fully formed. It was the product of a specific, demanding design brief that took nearly a decade to satisfy. In the early 1980s, the U.S. Navy began looking for a cartridge that could defeat light body armor at 1,000 meters, remain consistently supersonic and stable to 1,500 meters, and fit in a bolt-action rifle that a single operator could deploy from a prone position. Research Armament Company in the United States began development, working eventually in partnership with Lapua, a Finnish ammunition manufacturer whose name would eventually attach itself permanently to the cartridge. The first functional .338 LM rounds appeared in 1989. What makes the cartridge exceptional is a combination of case capacity, projectile weight, and what ballisticians call the ballistic coefficient. The case is a large-capacity belted magnum design, capable of holding enough propellant to push a 250-grain bullet to approximately 915 meters per second at the muzzle. The ballistic coefficient of the bullet, a dimensionless number expressing how efficiently the projectile resists air drag in relation to its mass, is among the highest of any standard production rifle projectile. A high ballistic coefficient means the bullet retains its velocity across distance far more efficiently than a lower BC round of similar size. Compare the flight envelopes directly. A standard 147-grain 7.62 NATO bullet, fired at 840 meters per second, enters the transonic zone, the unstable band between roughly 340 and 420 meters per second, where aerodynamic forces become unpredictable, at around 800 to 900 meters. From that point, the round's behavior becomes probabilistic rather than deterministic. A skilled shooter can compensate partially, but the physics are working against precision. The 250-grain .338 Lapua Magnum, by contrast, does not reach the transonic zone until approximately 1,400 meters. That is an additional 500 to 600 meters of reliable, predictable, compensable flight. In an engagement environment where the critical targets are positioned specifically to exploit the limitations of the 7.62, those extra hundreds of meters are not marginal, they are decisive. There is also a terminal effect consideration that rarely makes it into the public conversation about long-range sniping. A bullet that arrives at its target while still supersonic delivers its energy in a fundamentally different way than one that has gone subsonic. A subsonic 338 Lapua at 1,400 meters still carries enough energy to be lethal. But a supersonic 338 Lapua at 1,200 meters is not merely lethal, it is immediately incapacitating in a way that matters when the alternative is a gunner continuing to fire for several seconds after being hit. In a sustained firefight, the difference between instant incapacitation and delayed incapacitation is not abstract. It is measured in the rounds that the enemy fires in those final seconds. Now we go back to Helmand, back to the compound wall, back to Craig Harrison. Corporal of Horse Craig Harrison had been in the household cavalry for over a decade by 2009. He was not a career sniper in the formal sense. His regiment, the Blues and Royals, trains its own reconnaissance specialists rather than routing them through the standard Army sniper course at Brecon. But Harrison had accumulated thousands of hours behind a scope, and he had the particular quality that separates a good shot from a great one. He was calm in the specific way that is not the absence of adrenaline, but the mastery of it. On the day in question, his patrol had stopped to clear a compound. 2 PKM machine gun teams had engaged from a position across open ground. 12 British soldiers were pinned. The troop commander was exposed. Harrison moved to a firing position against a mud wall, took a kneeling stance, not prone, not from a bipod on flat ground, but kneeling, which introduces additional variables from body mechanics alone, and told his spotter to range the target. The laser rangefinder returned 2,475 meters. The L115A3 is rated and zeroed for engagements to 1,500 meters. This target was nearly a kilometer beyond that limit. Harrison's Schmidt and Bender PM2 scope, one of the finest precision optics in military service, has a maximum elevation adjustment of approximately 25 milliradians. At 2,475 meters, the required elevation correction exceeds what the turrets can physically provide. He had to use the subtension marks in the reticle, hash marks below the main crosshair, as his aiming reference, holding so high that the enemy gunners were not in the center of his field of view at all. He was aiming at sky and trusting physics to arc the bullet down to them. The environmental corrections at that range become a catalog of humbling variables. The temperature was high, affecting air density and therefore drag. The altitude above sea level was several hundred meters, again affecting density. The wind between Harrison's position and the target was neither uniform in speed nor direction across that distance, and wind at the bullet's apex, the highest point of its parabolic arc, somewhere around 20 to 25 meters above the ground, could differ from the surface reading entirely. Harrison and his spotter would have been reading vegetation movement, dust, mirage shimmer, everything available to them. He fired bracketing shots first, 9 of them, not to damage the target, but to read the fall of shot, watching where the rounds struck the ground relative to the gunners, feeding that information back into the ballistic solution, refining the hold. 9 rounds at a human-sized target, 2,475 meters away, each one arriving 6 seconds after the trigger broke, each one a data point. This is not how sniping is depicted in film, where the shot is singular and inevitable. This is how it is actually practiced at extreme range, iteratively, scientifically, with patience as a tactical tool. Then he was satisfied with the solution. He fired. The bullet left the barrel at approximately 920 meters per second. It was supersonic for the first 1,375 meters of its flight. Then it crossed into the transonic zone and slowed through it, becoming subsonic for the final 1,100 meters of a journey that lasted 6 seconds from muzzle to impact. 6 seconds is a long time when you understand what is happening inside them. The earth rotated beneath the bullet's path. The wind acted on it across more than 2 kilometers of open air. The bullet's gyroscopic stability, imparted by the rifling, decayed slowly as velocity fell. Every physical force that could act on a projectile did. The first bullet struck the first gunner in the abdomen. The second fighter moved toward the weapon. Harrison acquired him through the scope, recalculated, and fired again, another 6-second wait. The second gunner was hit. A third round disabled the machine gun itself. 3 rounds fired, 3 hits, at a distance that no published military manual had contemplated as a realistic engagement parameter.
It is worth pausing here to let the physics settle, because the numbers are sufficiently extreme that they become abstract without translation. At 2,475 meters, the angular size of a human torso in a precision rifle scope is approximately 0.3 milliradians. That is roughly the width of a standard pencil held at arm's length. The entire target, the thing Harrison needed to hit, subtended less space in his optic than a piece of office stationery does when you hold it 12 inches from your eye. Every source of error in the system, every micron of trigger movement, every degree of barrel cant, every kilometer per hour of unread wind expressed itself at the target as a deflection that could easily exceed that angular width entirely. The Coriolis effect is not a metaphor at this range. The Earth's rotation deflects a projectile in flight. At 31 degrees north latitude, roughly where Helmand Province sits, and firing in a northerly direction, the Coriolis deflection on a 6-second flight time is approximately 0.8 to 1.2 meters to the right. That is a correction that has to be calculated and applied before the shot, not observed afterward. Harrison and his spotter would have been working with a ballistic table or a mental model that accounted for this. The shot was not instinctive, it was calculated. There is also an atmospheric phenomenon at extreme range called the Magnus effect, the tendency of a spinning projectile to drift perpendicular to both its axis of spin and its direction of travel. For a right-hand twist barrel, this produces a consistent drift to the right. At 2,475 meters, that drift accumulates to something in the range of half a meter to a full meter depending on conditions. Again, a pre-calculated correction, not an afterthought. When you layer all of these corrections, elevation, wind, Coriolis, spin drift, density altitude, temperature, and you understand that each one had to be estimated from incomplete sensory information and applied simultaneously to a single firing solution, the achievement becomes clear not as a feat of marksmanship in the conventional sense, but as a feat of applied physics under duress. Harrison did not simply shoot well, he solved a multivariable physics problem with human lives as the stakes while kneeling against a mud wall under fire in Afghanistan. He has, in the years since, consistently refused to call it anything other than a fluke. That humility is accurate in one sense. The probabilistic element in any shot at that range is irreducible. You cannot eliminate chance entirely. But a fluke requires the conditions for success to exist. Harrison created those conditions through his training, his knowledge of his weapon, his ability to read environment, and his calm. The round did the rest. An Apache helicopter confirmed the engagement distance with its laser rangefinder shortly afterward, 2,475 meters. The previous confirmed sniper record had been set at 2,430 meters by a Canadian soldier in 2002. Harrison's shots exceeded it by 45 meters, and unlike the Canadian record, which involved a single confirmed kill, Harrison had achieved 3 hits on 2 personnel targets and 1 piece of equipment. The record was entered into the Guinness World Records, and then the Ministry of Defense made a decision that would have consequences Harrison could not have anticipated. In May 2010, 6 months after the shots were fired, the Ministry of Defense released Harrison's name to the press. The record had been reported in military and specialist circles, but the release of his identity brought the story to mainstream media globally.
Within days, the coverage had reached audiences in regions where it translated as not heroism, but as a target designation. Al-Qaeda-aligned forums identified Harrison by name. Death threats were made against him and his family, some specific enough in their detail to be credible. Harrison, his wife, and their children were moved into safe houses. For 3 years he moved irregularly, changed routines, and lived under the low-grade but unrelenting stress of a man who knew that a community capable of global coordination had reason to want him dead. He was still in uniform during most of this period. The Army did not discharge him. It did not, in his account, do very much at all to systematically support him through what had become an entirely new and unanticipated threat to his safety. He was diagnosed with severe post-traumatic stress disorder. The combination of 22 years of operational service, including tours in the Gulf, in Northern Ireland, in Iraq, and in Afghanistan, and the particular stress of the post-record period, had accumulated beyond what his nervous system could continue to absorb. He was medically discharged in 2014. The Ministry of Defense eventually paid him £100,000 in compensation for the unauthorized disclosure of his identity. Harrison has noted publicly that no official has ever apologized directly to him for the decision. He wrote a memoir, The Longest Kill, published in 2015. He founded the Maverick Survival School, using outdoor skills and structured exposure to natural environments as a framework for helping veterans manage trauma. He has spoken candidly about PTSD in a culture, military, British, male, that for a long time provided very few sanctioned paths for that candor. In doing so, he has arguably done more for the long-term welfare of veterans than the record itself ever could. The rifle is a tool. The man behind it bears the weight.
Harrison's record did not merely set a number. It closed an argument that had been running inside NATO sniper communities for the better part of a decade. The argument was about the intermediate cartridge. On one side, the 7.62 establishment, which pointed to the round's proven track record, its logistics tail already embedded in every NATO army, its suitability for the vast majority of sniper tasks. On the other side, the advocates for the .338 class, who argued that the operational environment had changed, that the threat envelope had expanded, and that the 7.62 platform was being asked to do work it was not architected for. This argument had been running in papers, in doctrine conferences, in armorers' workshops. It had not been resolved. After November 2009, it was resolved, not by a paper, by a result. A single operator carrying a 6.8-kilogram rifle on a dismounted patrol had reached a target at a distance that a 14-kilogram .50 caliber crew weapon had not been deployed to engage. The .338 class had demonstrated not merely that it could reach further than the 7.62, which was already known, but that it could do so in the tactical conditions, mobility, concealment, individual operation, where the .50 caliber was not viable. The ripple moved outward from that confirmation. Canada, which had been operating the C-14 Timberwolf in .338 Lapua Magnum since 2005, expanded its program. Australia moved toward a .338 platform. Norway, Sweden, Finland, the Netherlands, nations whose sniper programs were already sophisticated, accelerated transitions or expanded procurement. Germany began evaluation. France, operating the PGM Hecate-2 in .50 BMG as its extreme range platform, began looking at intermediate options for the cases where the Hecate was too heavy to deploy. The United States, the world's largest defense procurement entity and institutionally one of the slowest to change, moved more cautiously. The M2010 Enhanced Sniper Rifle, adopted in 2011, chambered the .300 Winchester Magnum, a significant improvement on 7.62 NATO, with a transonic transition at approximately 1,100 to 1,200 meters, but still not a full step into the .338 tier.
The Special Operations Command had been using various .338 platforms for years in a less formal capacity, but the conventional force held back. The precision sniper competition finally concluded in 2019 with the adoption of the Barrett Mk22 multi-role adaptive design, a chassis rifle chambered primarily in .338 Norma Magnum, with conversion kits for .300 Norma Magnum and .338 Lapua Magnum. Britain had been operating the L115A3 for over a decade by the time the United States Army formally accepted its equivalent. Britain was not ahead because it had a larger budget. It was not ahead because it had a more advanced industrial base. It was ahead because its soldiers articulated a problem from the ground, from the gap, and its procurement system responded with a precise, measured answer rather than waiting for the answer to become obvious to everyone. Harrison's record did not stand forever. Records in this domain rarely do, partly because the physics permit further extension, and partly because the wars of the 21st century have provided operational conditions, long sight lines, static front lines, well-resourced sniper programs that allow extreme range engagements to occur and be confirmed. In June 2017, a Canadian Joint Task Force 2 operator engaged and killed an Islamic State fighter at a confirmed distance of 3,450 meters in Iraq. The weapon was a Macmillan TAC-50, a bolt-action .50 BMG rifle weighing approximately 11 kilograms without its scope or suppressor. The bullet was in the air for approximately 9.9 seconds. The Canadian military confirmed the engagement through multiple corroborating sources. It was a remarkable achievement, technically, physically, and in terms of the applied ballistics required. Ukrainian sniper teams have, since the onset of the full-scale Russian invasion in 2022, claimed several engagements at distances approaching and potentially exceeding 4,000 meters using 14.5mm anti-material rifles, weapons designed originally to defeat radar systems and light armored vehicles. Confirmation of these claims is complicated by the operational context, but multiple have been corroborated by independent observers. Here is the distinction that matters and that gets consistently buried in the headline distance number. The Canadian record was set with a weapon requiring a static, prepared firing position. The TAC-50 is not a rifle a single soldier carries on a patrol. It is a rifle a sniper pair transports to a hide, assembles, zeros, and uses from a fixed point. Its operational mobility is essentially zero compared to the L115A3. The Ukrainian anti-material rifles are even more extreme, weapons so large and loud that concealment is not a viable consideration. They are fired from fortified positions with full situational awareness of the surrounding area. Harrison's record was set at a range where none of those resources were available. He was on a foot patrol. He had the weapon on his back. He was under incoming fire. He moved to a wall, took a firing position that any sniper instructor would note is far from ideal for extreme range work, and he hit a target nearly 2.5 kilometers away, 3 times, in the space of a few minutes. The distance numbers overlap in the record books. The tactical contexts do not overlap at all. The L115A3 proved something the record books cannot fully capture, that the most effective long-range precision weapon is not always the one that can reach the furthest. It's the one that can reach far enough, wherever the soldier happens to be. As of early 2026, the L115A3 is still in British service. Its successor program, known as Project Shammer, is in development, and Accuracy International has moved on to the AX series, which refines the chassis concept with improved ergonomics and modularity. But the philosophy is unchanged. The same aluminum spine, the same commitment to eliminating every variable that is eliminable, the same idea that a rifle is a scientific instrument, and that science in service of a clear purpose is the most powerful force a procurement office can deploy. Malcolm Cooper died in 2001, before his weapon set its record. He did not live to see what his Olympic shooter's instinct for precision produced in the mountains of Helmand. But the rifle he built carried his philosophy into that valley, and it performed exactly as a man who understood precision would have expected it to.
Craig Harrison lives with what that day gave him and what it cost him in equal measure. He has said that he doesn't think about the record. He thinks about the 12 men who walked away from that patrol. That is the calculation a soldier makes that a record book cannot contain. The L115A3 is not flashy. It does not have a dramatic silhouette or a name that sounds like a weapon of myth. It is green, it is bolt action, and it is quiet about what it can do. On that day in Helmand, it was not the loudest gun in the valley. It was just the one that reached the furthest. What matters more to a modern sniper, the raw, destructive reach of a .50 caliber or the surgical mobility of the .338? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every one. If this deep dive gave you something, subscribe. There is more where this came from, the weapons, the decisions, and the people who shaped the way war is fought. I am the narrator. This was the longest kill. I'll see you in the next one.